Hi, everyone, and welcome to this lesson on social identity and who you are matters. I'm going to start, I'm going to pose a few questions to you. I want you to think about how you communicate with people in your own profession. Now, thinking about that, do you talk differently to colleagues if they are of the same discipline as you, compared to those who are of different disciplines to you? Do you use the same language, the same phrases, the same tone? Do you speak to someone more senior than you the same as you do a peer, or to someone more junior than you? Do you at work talk the same as how you do at home? Is it different? And how so? So these are the things we're going to discuss today, right? Is around who you are will influence how you speak and how you listen. So there's a few theory, right? Yeah. Very important theories that inform communication. But I see you all yawning and going, oh my God, theory. So instead of going through these theories, let's talk about music festivals. Yeah, much more fun. So we're at a music festival. Have you ever been to one? You've got hundreds of tents all blasting different types of music. There's a heavy metal tent, a classical music tent, maybe a techno tent. Which one do you walk into? The one that feels like your vibe, right? That's fundamental social identity theory in action, right? Our brains love our tribes. So research says that who we identify with, our tribe, or they call it social group, shapes how we listen, how we interpret messages, and how we respond to them. According to social identity theory, we favor our in-group, so the people in the same tent as us. And sometimes we intentionally try and keep our distance from those who are different to us, the out-group, the people in the other tents. It makes sense, right? Who wants to, I guess, hang out in a tent playing harpsichord when you're into heavy metal music? So here's the kicker. We're motivated to make our own tribe, our own tent look good because it's fundamentally about status and about belonging. Plus, we're kind of drawn to people who are similar to us. And this is similarity attraction theory, right? So what you'll tend to do if you're in the classical tent is maybe want to close the tent door uh, to keep the heavy metal music out so you remain distinctly different from the other tent. But here's the thing where we've got an other layer that can get a bit messy, and that's attribution theory. And it says that we judge others' actions based on what we think motivates them to behave the way they do. So if someone from another tent says something we don't like, so just say I'm hanging out at the heavy metal tent outside and someone from the classical tent walks past and doesn't look at me, doesn't say hello, I'll be like, oh, arrogant. Those classical tent people. While if I do the same thing when I'm walking past another tent and I don't say hello, I'll attribute that to being, I was in a hurry, I was racing to the bathroom. I I had to be somewhere quickly and I didn't have time for a conversation. So this is what's called the fundamental attribution error, where we tend to attribute our own motivation and intent to things out of our control, like the situation or the context, right? But we tend to attribute intent of other people to their character and their internal attributions, like their personality. So that's the fundamental attribution error. What can happen, though, is to try and keep our groups separate and distinct. We often apply these attributions, these character-based attributions, to the whole entire group, right? The whole entire heavy metal tent, not just one person or the classical tent. So if I was a nurse and I spoke up and one doctor, ignored me or shot me down, and I walk away and go, oh, doctors never listen to nurses, right? I attribute that to the whole entire group that is doctors. That is what's called the ultimate attribution error. And this is where we start making stereotypes about different groups of people. And this is where communication becomes harder because we're making these attributions and stereotypes, right? Like all jazz fans hate rock music, right? When clearly out there in the world, there are people that like both. So, how does this relate to health? Well, if you're in the health tent, you probably feel more connected with other people in that tent. So birds of a feather, that kind of thing. So you may have heard in some of the literature, it talks about tribes within healthcare, right? So that might be tribes being disciplines or specialties. And we tend to congregate with people in the same tent, so who are similar to us. So nurses might favor nurses, doctors might tend to favor doctors, right? Coming back to similarity attraction theory. Context is super, super important here. So who we are, what is our most prominent identity within that conversation is going to be dependent on context. So if I am in the classical tent in the music festival, my most salient identity in that context is a lover of classical music. And I might have a doctor next to me who I work with who shares that identity because we're both in the classical tent. However, if myself and that doctor are in a clinical situation within the hospital in front of the patient and I see an error with a medication order and I speak up, I'm speaking up as Mel, the nurse, and that person is the doctor. So those are the most salient identities within that context, and that will influence how we communicate, how we listen, how we hear the words we use and the phrases. We can choose to be more similar together, so accommodate to each other's communication needs, or we might want to be distinctly different, and that will influence communication, and it often leads to miscommunication. So, what's the takeaway? So, perceived similarity builds closeness, and there are benefits to that, and there's also issues to that. Miscommunication often comes from making wrong assumptions about other people's intent and not their actual behavior. And also, too, we can forget that people come, we might be in the same situation, but depending on who they are and who their identity is in that moment, will influence their worldviews and perceptions, and will therefore influence how they communicate, how they listen, how they interpret messages. So next time you're tempted to judge someone from the other tent, ask yourself, is it the music that they're playing, or is the assumptions that we're making about them? So let's continue. So as I said, context is important, and it will determine what your most prominent social identity is in the moment. So in the hospital setting, my research around receivership of messages in speaking up showed that discipline and seniority were the key social identities that directly influence communication behavior within these interactions. When you look at speaking up training, we learn set phrases. So set mnemonics, set phrases. So what you now know, knowing social identity theory, is one size doesn't fit all. Like, how I speak is not going to be how a doctor speaks or how a physiotherapy speaks in a given situation within the clinical context. So how we hear and receive that message is going to be different, right? Regardless of what the message is. And yet again, there's another layer. So it's not just professional seniority that affects, right? There's subspecialties within a profession. So Dr. David Hewitt studied communication between medical specialties, looking at gastroenterology and emergency departments, and looked at how they communicate. And there were distinct differences and intentional distinct differences in how that communication played out, because the two groups wanted to remain distinctly different groups, which led to issues with communication and miscommunication. Right? So group identity directly informs communication, and it can be at multiple levels, from departments, teams, organizations, down to the individual. So in my studies, I studied nursing, midwifery, allied health, and medical officers. And as I said, group identity influenced communication behavior. So let's look at a few things to make it more tangible. Nurses and midwives and allied health, when they were receiving speaking up messages across several of my studies, preferred to receive accommodative and really relational type messages. They found them much easier to receive and to engage in a conversation and to respond. Medical officers did not care if the message was delivered harsh and abruptly or accommodatively and relationally. Fundamentally, they just wanted the message delivered, right? So we can start seeing how one size doesn't fit all if we've got scripted text, because different professions prefer different communication styles. Context was everything for nurses and midwives, and I'll get into that in a second. But also how the messages were heard was, it wasn't just up hierarchy messages, it was down hierarchy messages. And so juniors were highly impacted by messages coming down the hierarchy, no matter how polite and accommodating they were delivered, right? It caused a lot of emotional angst. So we need to be aware of that. Discipline also influenced how, in a given situation, the level of risk was assessed. So you can imagine in a level of risk that if I come to a situation and I speak up because I deem the risk really high, and the receiver of that message goes, oh, no, it's low, don't worry about it, I may feel my concern is dismissed, and that I wasn't heard, and I'll find that interaction quite dissatisfying, and it's going to influence how I speak up again in the future, particularly to that person. So this is where we need to take speaking up training and communication training, is beyond the scripted text, to teach people how to engage in a conversation, because there is no problem whatsoever with assessing the risk differently depending on your worldview and your level of experience, right? That is not the problem. The problem is people are not taught to engage in a conversation, to share thinking, to share perspectives, to understand each other's perspectives, and then how to negotiate an outcome, a way forward, right? That's where we need to take speaking up training. It also influences social identity and how internal cognitions are framed. So these are the attributions, right? So allied health were awesome at making positive attributions about other people and other disciplines when spoken up to. So even if the message was delivered really harshly and abruptly, which they didn't like, they were really good in the moment of going, you know what? I don't like how that message was delivered, but I believe this person is really concerned about patient safety, so I'm going to engage. So they prevented those attribution errors, right, by attributing negative intent. They really attributed positive intent, which allowed them to engage in a conversation. The influence of context. So nurses and midwives in particular did not like at all being spoken up to with an audience present, whether that is the patient or other members of the interdisciplinary team, right? So you need to know, based on social identity, if you are speaking up to a nurse or midwife and other people are present, that your message may not be received how you want it to be received. So think about context. And if it's not an emergency, think about, can we move away from other people? Because I know, based on social identity, this is how that person likes being communicated with. And your message will be received better. And yeah, this also influences the outcome of conversations and evaluations for future interactions. So to wrap up, telling people, for example, just to speak up doesn't mean they can do so because of all these influencing factors: social identity, worldviews, context of the situation. We need to help people and give them the skills to navigate context and social identity in the moment. This means not learning set phrases, but learning communication skills. So I know this content is quite tricky. It's very dense and a lot here. Fundamentally, we need to understand that your main identity in a given situation will influence how you see the situation and how the other person sees the situation. And that's the conversation you need to have, right? To understand each other's perspectives, not make assumptions about intent or assumptions that people see through your worldview. What I highly recommend is keep going with the lesson, go through the content, take your time, and at the end, come back and rewatch this video. And I think a lot more pieces will fall into place. So enjoy, and I look forward to your feedback at the end. Thank you.